Welcome to Simple Healthy Life, where our goal is to have real discussions on topics that we find interesting. And MJ, we were just kind of riffing about um, how a lot of people tend to not be emotionally courageous, I think is kind of what we landed on. And by that, you were suggesting that many people, in fact, men specifically, might tend to avoid emotions or circumvent that in the face of stoicism, or in other words, they they use stoicism or this like I don't feel emotion kind of thing to circumvent painful, um, perhaps uncomfortable emotions. And so I guess the question I have for you is like, why were you thinking about that?
Oh man, make it deeply personal right out the gate. While I was personal. I was thinking about it from a personal perspective. I have been dealing with some emotions that I haven't had to deal with in a very very long time. Number one was grief,
Hmm.
and I started to think about whether or not I could keep this feeling down, whether I could keep it, just go about my day without crying or without taking it out on somebody.
Hmm.
And I actually committed to one day just trying that and just saying that, I don't need to show grief. That was my way of handling it. I'm not going to show anybody that I'm grieving.
Hmm.
Didn't work. By the end of the day, I was yelling and upset, and I think I did cry that day. So the next day I was like, well, I got to handle it a little bit better than that. So I did a little bit of meditation, I sat down, and I realized that it's not easier. It's not easier to remain stoic and push all the emotions down.
Hmm.
It's easier to deal with them over the long run. It's easier to acknowledge them, identify them, understand them, and then feel them. And the secret there for me is feeling them. I know kind of a heavy topic we jumped into but from a grief perspective, I was able to feel it for the first time. I felt it in my body. I think you were kind of turned my eyes open to some bodily feelings, especially around hunger cues. We did a whole episode on that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I now that I have a bodily feeling in when I have grief,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like a heaviness,
Yeah.
like a weighted blanket on me.
Mm.
And I started to address that. I started to sit and address it, and there was a lot of crying and a lot of feeling. The crying stopped when the feeling started. It was almost like I moved past crying into just feeling it and understanding it. And while I'm still grieving and still feel it, I started to really think about how many people don't know this. How many people don't realize what has taken me a little bit of time to identify. So I wanted to bring it out and share it with everybody. That's where the genesis of this was.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, that particular emotion is a really tough one. It's interesting because we almost perceive reaction as expressing emotion sometimes, or like when you think about grief, you think, well, crying. If I'm grieving appropriately, then I'm crying a lot, and there might be some truth to that. But in a lot of ways, I don't think emotions need to have any particular kind of reaction to them for us to like fully feel, right? And we'll kind of circle back to grief, but just as a case in point, I actually had a dream last night of all these different things happened in the dream, and it was very vivid and very real. Like it was one of those ones where I had no awareness of the dream at all. Like I was in it, and there was like there was a number of people who were just like pissing me off in the dream, but I was getting so angry, and I'm not in like what I wouldn't describe myself as a very angry person. In fact, quite the opposite. I feel that I have like a good sense of anger. I have a good control of that, in the sense that like I feel it, but I don't feel any need to react. Right? If you think about someone who like has a lot of reaction to the anger emotion, they're flipping out, they're yelling, they're punching walls, they're getting into fights, like all of that kind of stuff. And that's exactly what the dream was. I was like yelling and fighting, and it was bad. And I woke up and I was like, that is so strange because it is nothing like me. I don't yell, I don't punch holes in walls. I've just never done that. And so, yeah, I found that to be relevant because I feel that there are a lot of emotions that we have reactions to, and I think anger is almost like an easy one for people to understand. And I often use that example as, in discussions with clients about how we cope, right? And anger is kind of an easy one for us to understand. Well, there's some reaction there that is not appropriate, but there is a way to process anger, right? And to your point, maybe you need to sit there and feel the physical sensations of that emotion, because there really is physical emotions with every physical sensations with every emotion. And that's actually a really good meditation to do, is to, you're feeling grief or you're feeling anger or you're feeling embarrassment, right? Like okay, start with where does it physically feel? And that in some ways helps you process without reacting, because it gives you like a really almost tangible thing to focus on.
Absolutely. So one of the things I learned during this period is, and of course I did a little bit of reading and studying because it was a tough one for me, but I came across this concept of energy. Emotions are energy in motion, which if you just think about it, just pretend that the word energy means whatever it means to you. That's energy in the body. Well, you're going to feel that energy somewhere. And for me, I've noticed now that I do feel that energy. I do feel when I have anxiety, I feel that fidgety energy. When I feel grief, like I have been, that energy was heavy and consistent. And I would be 100% honest with you to tell you that I was afraid to add more grief by feeling it. I was like, well, if I just push it off, I'll be able to deal with it in the future. Like things will fade and my emotions won't be as strong, so I'll be able to deal with it then. Didn't work for me. It just didn't work. It was too strong, too much. So I had to find another way to deal with it. And I'm not saying that I'm courageous for doing it, but I am saying that when you think about courage as doing something not in the absence of fear, but doing something knowing that you're afraid, that's when emotional courage came into play. That's when I was like, wow, I think maybe that made me feel better. I was like, I was courageous today. I dealt with my grief. I sat with it. I listened to it. I felt it. It didn't actually make me feel better in the moment, but it was almost like a processing tool where I feel like I processed it faster or better than I had processed things like this in the past. It makes sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the way I understand it and tend to view the whole like emotional processing thing is that it's gonna come out in one way, right? And we had discussions in our like men's mental health podcast about how men typically don't process emotions well, and that manifests in crime and stuff like that. It's like it's more likely that a man will repress emotions, and then it will more likely in men manifest in fighting and robbery and all these other all these
behaviors
other
that are not what they want to be behaving like.
Exactly. And why would you fight someone? Why would you murder someone? Or there's something you're not processing. There's some sort of like emotion that you can't handle, and these things are then coming out. And so, yeah, that is super interesting. And in the point you said about, courage is almost doing the thing where the which you know what the consequences are, you know what the feelings are, and you're doing it anyways. And I think that kind of probably relates to like the general idea of courage almost. Like I almost, first off the bat, if we're not talking like emotional courage, we're just talking like general courage, like, being in an army and being at war and being on front lines and being the person who has to like charge in, right? Like it's a thought that I have often because I'm like, I don't know if that's something I could do. Just like charge in for this thing where you don't necessarily like, you're not going to gain anything. You're most certainly just going to get mowed down, and I think a lot of these people who engage in that stuff probably knew. They probably weren't ignorant to the fact that they're just going to go in and march to their death. And there's like a lot of recounts of these days and stories and all of that where, yeah, people were just sick to their stomach as they were
as
as
it
they
was
were
happening.
doing it, right? And you got to think, well, they just did it. They just knew. They knew what was they were getting into, and they just did it. And so, yeah, I think, you know, point in case, or case in point rather, about, this emotional courage, knowing that if you open the doors to grief, then you're gonna be feeling it. I mean, you're gonna feel it hard and heavy, and it's gonna be tough for a little while, but hopefully not forever.
Hopefully not forever, right?
Right.
So, what do you think we can offer or talk about for people that might say, you know what, I like the concept, I like the idea of being courageous around my feelings, and I like the idea of working through them, but no one's ever taught me how.
Mm.
No one's ever offered me kind of a specific how.
Mm.
Um, I'll open it up to you. Is there anything that you can offer anybody to just say like, how might you go about it? You by your own account and by mine as well. You process anger well,
Mm.
right? I'm learning to process grief, and I'm not saying well, but I'm learning to process
Mm.
that. So you have a tool in your toolbox or something. What could you offer people?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I can use the anger example, right? Um, because again, I think it's very like tangible, almost tangible emotion, right? It's very strong, right? Um, but I mean, I think as with anything, you have to identify, right? There's you don't know if you're in jail unless you recognize, you identify it, right? It's like, and so the same thing here. You don't. How can you possibly know you're experiencing anger if you don't identify it? And so knowing yourself, the whole like know thyself thing is really important. And so, part of that is as you engage with more mindfulness and being more conscious and being more intentional and trying to understand yourself, I mean, I think you have to understand what emotions you're experiencing. And it's not that you don't feel them. I mean, people have different degrees to which they feel emotions. That I believe. I think that there's some people who are a little bit more emotional, just generally. Their pendulum swings a little bit further, right? Um, but you experience something. So if you're experiencing anger, identify that, right? And maybe then start to identify, are there behaviors related to this? And so in the anger example, if you notice, I am angry right now, right? You say that to yourself. Are you yelling at people? Are you, is your body tight? Are you clenching your fists? Are you tightening up? What are these, like, how is anger manifesting in your behaviors and in your body? And try not to do that, right? Like the reactions that you're having aren't helpful. And so that's where I think stoicism gets it right, it's the reaction that there's this automatic reaction that happens from any emotions that's not necessarily correct, right? It's not like what you would call right action. And so identifying both the feeling and any reactions, and then thinking about like how I would go about processing this. And so that's where like coping comes into play. And I think coping is really important, we talk about coping in a lot of different ways, on this podcast. But I think in the example of anger, you're not coping with anger by going for a walk, probably like a leisurely stroll in a flowery field, right? It's like probably not the best way to cope with that. Although that can be a coping strategy for something else, just well and good. But yeah, I mean, so maybe you feel the need to scream, so then scream. I know plenty of people who that's how they process emotion. The anger emotion, they like to scream, or maybe it is a combat sport. Maybe you get out anger by doing some jujitsu, or maybe more like vigorous exercise in general. Maybe that helps blow off some steam. But your coping needs to make sense. And just as like if you're, I don't know, if you're feeling, sadness, maybe going to jujitsu and beating people up, maybe that does or doesn't help. But I would venture to say that's probably not the best coping strategy for that. So, just making sure that you're identifying how you're acting, what you're feeling, but then going about coping in a way that actually makes sense, a way that you're actually processing that feeling and emotion, and part of that is you're going to know by trial and error, and some of that is development too. So you can't necessarily find a coping strategy as much as you can develop one. And so if you're saying, I'm feeling angry right now, well, what makes sense to process that? Well, I'm going to go punch a pillow or whatever. Okay. So then every time you're feeling angry, go punch a pillow for a minute or something, or go scream into a pillow. And then over time, your mind is going to start to say, well, this is just what I do when I'm angry. If you, every time you're angry, you go home and yell at your wife, yeah, one, not the best. Two, and maybe more importantly, you're going to start to do this automatically. You're going to have unconscious behavior that then your brain is pulling you into those behaviors of yelling at people. And so it's really important to start training your mind to do the coping strategy automatically. That makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. So identify, understand, and then develop some type of coping strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And what would you say to people that say, well, that's too hard?
Things are hard, man.
Yeah, life is hard. We're trying to offer you real solutions, not just
choose your hard. Like, I mean, you're choosing that, which is a bit of a process. It's gonna hit your ego or something like that. There's gonna be hard within that, or you're gonna choose your hard when you get a divorce because you can't manage your anger. I mean, like, what is the hard that you want to choose? And so you have a choice on that front. Thankfully, like, we're not just, a lot of us, not stuck in the worst of worst, terrible situations. Luckily, we can choose, our hard a lot of the time. And that's a luxury that many people don't have.
Would you say, so I'm going to use myself as an example, and I'm going to personify this.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say most people learn to manage their emotions by the way that they see their adult figures in their life handle their emotions?
Mm-hmm.
I'll go further than just your mom and dad, but like the people that are around you when you were younger,
mm-hmm.
by noticing the way that they handled it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Movies, shows, loved ones, hated ones. Like, it's the context, right? And the context of your life really defines a lot of your life, and part of that is just because that's how the brain works. The brain is just one big piece of hardware, and you don't really have as much say as you think you do. And so, yeah, if you're around, an abusive, parent, for example, and they're processing their anger in an inappropriate way, and they're abusive, well, chances are you probably going to process it in a very similar way. And if you think about this and you start to like process your own emotions, well, maybe then you go the complete opposite direction, and maybe that's how you someone processes that kind of like trauma, but there's always like a little bit of a choice there. But it is hard. I mean, in that example of someone processing anger from the context of abuse in a healthful way, despite growing up in that, I mean, that does take a lot of work, because they're going to have a lot of like natural almost tendencies to act in that way. And that's why, we always talk about like social media feeds and the people we interact with, and all of that is super important, because the context, every moment of existence is kind of defining what your brain is how it's acting, really.
I agree. It made this grief that I've been going through made me step back and challenge some of my belief systems, and maybe challenge a lot more than just my belief systems, if you can believe it or not, my world in general. And what I realize is that, I guess the only way to say this is that the things that I love to practice, right? I love to practice martial arts in some regards, call them whatever you want. I love to practice yoga. I love to practice meditation. All of those require me to learn and then kind of go back to the fundamentals, tear them apart, start again. Learn, go back to the fundamentals, tear them apart, start again. And I like that process. But when it comes to emotions, I want to say, I already learned that. I don't need to go back and tear it apart and start again. When it comes to my belief systems, I want to say, nope, they're right. That's who I am. I don't want to go back and tear them apart and start again. But in everything that I really do love and do respect about what I love, it requires me to go back, tear it apart, evaluate it, identify it, start again. And now I'm learning that emotions seem to be that same thing. It seemed to be the same exact process as everything else that I'm practicing. And the concept or the thought of doing that, I hope that I have done it at least one more time, so that the next time grief comes up in my life, I'll say something, to the effect of, okay, I've done this before. I can go back, start again, learn, grieve, let it go. But man, there's not much else that I've ever dealt with that feels like it's never going to end. When you're in it, when you're really in it, it's like, how could this ever go away? How could this feeling, which is the wildest thing to say, how could this feeling ever go away? But every other feeling that we've ever had has come and gone, right? I've been ecstatic about things that I can't even remember right now. I've been so sad about jobs I didn't get or events that didn't happen that I can't even remember right now. But when you're in it, when you're in that moment where you're grieving, you're like, this feeling will never go away. And I actually believe, for me, that a little bit of me wanted to feel that way, almost as if I was going to like hang on, like, it's okay, I won't let you go away. I won't let this grief end, because with that end of grief comes end of concern and worry, and maybe even end of thought. Like, I'm just not going to think I'm not grieving anymore, that they're gone, and that's all there is to it. And in the moment, it's scary. It's scary. It's scary. It's sad. It's frustrating. It's angry. It's all these different emotions coming at you at once.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're talking about attachment, right? And sometimes the clinging on is what we like to do. Right? You said something in there about this is who I am, or this is what I do. Those are very, and used it in a different context, but just generally picking on those, because I think those are thoughts that we all have that are kind of dangerous. Like, this is who I am, this is what I do. And we're much more likely to challenge that, I think, with, hobbies such as like martial arts, wrestling, jiu-jitsu. Like, someone could reevaluate their jiu-jitsu game and not be so attached to, I don't know, being a guard player, although, it's easier said than done, I suppose. But certainly I could sit there and say, well, this doesn't serve me super well, so I probably should reapproach this how I do this. Just kind of like you said, like build it back up, tear it down, build it back up, tear it down. Um, Yet when it comes to like internal things, how you process emotions and what that means for you and all of that, we're much less likely to let some of those identity based things go. And I think it's really important that you really aren't, you're not defined. You're like, we're constantly in the process of defining ourselves every moment. And that to me is really, really important. It's something that I think about often, is that not who I was. Every moment I'm defining it, and it's really important.
It feels empowering too,
Mm-hmm.
especially from where this my seat right now. I feel that that thought process is empowering. The thing that I took away from this experience more than anything, other than um, just feeling sadness in my body and never having experienced that before to this level, is that I think it's very important that we do these exercises like you talked about to identify and understand and cope when your emotions are at like a level 2,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
like, okay, sit down in the morning, you wake up, you got a busy day. Okay, I got a busy day. What is it that I'm feeling about that busy day? Am I anxious? Am I excited? Am I nervous? Am I concerned? Do I feel a certain way? Okay, cool. Now I get it. Now I've identified it. I understand
Mm-hmm.
it. It's almost like a practice. It's
Mm-hmm.
like practicing for the big one,
Yeah.
right? It's like
Yeah.
how often we get to practice will directly reflect and directly relate on our
Mm-hmm.
success when we have to deal with the challenges that will inevitably come for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that I'm someone who practices. But man, I got to tell you, I'm grateful that I do, because this one was a tough one for me. This really was.
Yeah. No, I can hear it in your voice, and yeah, it's grief especially is never an easy one. But yeah, I mean, such a good point. Yeah, practicing coping strategies for anxiety when you're 2 out of 10. You're not learning at 10 out of 10 anxiety. It's well beyond. At that point, you're just riding the waves, and maybe that's a little bit of what you would do with grief too, is just kind of ride the waves, because that emotion likely is a 10 out of 10, especially when the occurrence happens within the couple months or so. And so yeah, I don't think, to your point, there is no sense in cultivating a coping strategy when the emotional
Yeah.
level is so high. So yeah, no, truly like a really great point. And yeah, spending some time to actually think about these things is important. Spending too much time to think about these things is detrimental. And so I think that's to be said too. We're so distracted, and sometimes in one way that's kind of good, and another way we're never setting aside time to even consider how we're feeling. But then there are some people who have the identity of, I talk about my feelings, and that's problematic. And so trying to strike the balance between those two things is important.
Yeah. Well said. I will just add one last piece. For me, the coping strategy that helped me the most during this period of time was to be specific about my word choices.
Mm.
And they were specific in the fact that I wasn't saying, I'm fine. I'm okay. How are you? I'm fine. Everything okay? Yes. Right? I was like, actually, right now I'm feeling a lot of emotions right now, and I'm challenged by them. And I would be willing to talk to them, with my close friends and family, if they wanted to. And thankfully, I had people to talk to them with. And I don't. We're talking about it now, but I
Mm.
don't have to talk about it anymore. We can. I have managed my emotions through the process you talked about, identified, understand, chose a way to cope, and now we're moving forward. And I hope that a lot of people can take my story a little bit and use it for themselves, and
Mm.
just understand that eventually you're going to come up against this stuff that's going to shock you. It's going to rock you.
Mm.
Um, But in the end, they're just emotions. They're just energy in the body. Just got to identify them and work through them
Right. Ride that wave.
and ride that wave.
Yeah. Nice. Well, thanks, MJ. I
Appreciate
appreciate that. And yeah, you can check us out on most podcast platforms, and the links will be down below. Thanks.